The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, every woman in Ironwood Valley knew what it said. Edwin Pike had written it himself, neat, careful handwriting, the kind a man uses when he wants to look respectable while doing something cruel. He said Nora Bellamy had chased him for his money, said she'd embarrassed herself, said a woman like her had no business expecting anything better than what Kansas had already given her, which was nothing. He was wrong about everything. But Nora didn't know that yet. She was 32 years old, standing alone in a kitchen that wasn't hers anymore, holding a stranger's letter in hands that smelled like bread dough and medicine, wondering if maybe the whole world had already decided what she was worth, and decided it wasn't much. She was about to prove every single one of them wrong. If this kind of story speaks to you, the kind where an ordinary woman finds out she was extraordinary all along, please subscribe to this channel and follow Nora's journey all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The morning her mother died, Nora Bellamy did not cry. She had been awake for 31 hours straight. She had changed the sheets twice, boiled water she never used, and sat in the wooden chair beside the bed holding her mother's hand until the hand went still and the room went quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. Then she stood up, walked to the kitchen, and washed every dish in the house. It wasn't that she didn't feel anything. It was that she had been feeling things so hard for so long that her body had simply run out of room for one more emotion. Grief would come later, she knew that. It always came later, sneaking up behind you when you were doing something ordinary. Peeling potatoes, hanging laundry, reaching for a cup, and hitting you so hard your knees nearly went. But that morning, there were dishes to wash. Her mother, Ruth Bellamy, had been sick for 11 years. Not dramatically sick, not the kind of sickness that comes fast and leaves fast. The slow kind. The kind that grinds everything down. The patient first, then everyone around the patient, then the house itself, then the money, then the hope. By the time Ruth finally let go, the homestead was worth less than the debt attached to it. The neighbor's offer to buy the land came 3 days after the funeral, polite and low, and Nora accepted it because there was nothing else to do. She was 32 years old. She had $31, a battered leather suitcase, and a reputation she'd never asked for. The reputation was Edwin Pike's fault, though calling it his fault made it sound simpler than it was. Edwin had come courting the year before, or what passed for courting in a county where nobody had much time or money for anything fancy. He wrote letters first, which she'd appreciated. He was a merchant in the next town over, moderately successful, a widower himself, and his letters were pleasant enough without being dishonest. He seemed to want a capable woman more than a beautiful one, which suited Nora fine because she had never been the beautiful kind. She knew what she looked like. She'd known since she was 12 years old, and her aunt had said, with the particular cruelty that only family can manage, that Nora had a face built for hard work and not much else. Over the years, she'd made a kind of peace with it. She wasn't ugly, she was just plain. The kind of plain that men's eyes slide right past without stopping, looking for something that caught the light better. Edwin's letters didn't mention her looks. They talked about practical things, the price of flour, the difficulty of keeping accounts, the loneliness of an empty house. For a few months, Nora let herself hope. Then he came to see her in person. She would never forget the exact moment. She'd been standing at the door in her good dress. The blue one she'd let out twice because her shoulders had gotten broader from years of hauling water, and she'd watched his face arrange itself into a very specific expression. Not disgust, not cruelty. Something quieter and more devastating than either. Disappointment. He stayed for 2 hours. He was polite the entire time. He ate her biscuits and complimented them and asked 1 or 2 careful questions about her experience managing the homestead. Then he left. His next letter, which arrived 9 days later, explained that he'd given the matter serious thought and didn't believe they were suited to each other after all. He wished her well. He didn't mention her face. He didn't have to. Nora read that letter sitting at the kitchen table while her mother coughed in the next room, and she felt something in herself go very quiet. Not broken, exactly. Just rearranged, like furniture that's been moved and leaves faint marks on the floor where it used to be. She put the letter in the stove and went back to the sick room. That had been a year ago. Now her mother was gone, the land was sold, the $31 would run out in 6 weeks, and the county she'd spent her entire life in had nothing left to offer her. She was too old, too plain, and too tired to pretend otherwise. It was her neighbor, May Whitfield, who mentioned the advertisement. Not really an advertisement, more of a letter that had been passed around, the way things passed around in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business and most of it was dull. A rancher in Montana. A widower. Wealthy, by all accounts, though the word wealthy meant different things depending on who was saying it. He was looking for a capable woman to help manage his household. He'd made it clear he wasn't looking for romance, just competence. "You should write to him," May said, over the fence, the way May said everything, direct as a nail going into wood. "He'll want someone younger," Nora said. "He'll want someone who can actually run a house through a Montana winter. You've done harder things than that." That was true. Nora had done considerably harder things than that. She sat with the idea for 3 days before she got out paper and pen. And then she did something that frightened her more than anything she'd done in years. She told the truth. Not a polished version of the truth. Not a carefully worded version designed to present her best qualities in the softest possible light. She wrote the actual truth, the plain, unvarnished kind. And she did it because she was 32 years old and exhausted, and she simply didn't have the energy anymore for pretending to be something she wasn't and having it fail anyway. She wrote, "My name is Nora Bellamy. I am 32 years old. I am not a beautiful woman, and I have no social standing worth mentioning. I have spent the last 11 years caring for my mother, who died recently. And before that, I spent my childhood working a Kansas homestead that never quite made what we needed it to make. I have no money and no family nearby and no particular prospects in the county I come from." She stopped, looked at the page, kept going. "What I do have is this. I can cook a real meal from whatever is left in the pantry when the supply wagon is 2 weeks late. I can keep accurate accounts and stretch a household budget through months when everything costs more than it should. I can treat a minor wound well enough that it doesn't turn bad. And I can sit with someone who is suffering and not run from the room. I am not cheerful by nature, but I am steady. I do not quit when things become difficult. I have never once quit when things became difficult, and I have had considerable practice." She paused again, then added one last line, because she was already in this far and might as well finish honestly. "I know what I'm offering is not impressive, but it's real, and it's all entirely true." She addressed the envelope to Silas Mercer, Ironwood Valley, Montana, and walked it to the mail station before she could change her mind. Then she went home and told herself to forget about it. She almost managed it. Silas Mercer had received 47 letters. He hadn't asked for 47 letters. He'd made inquiries through the county land office, a quiet, private arrangement that somehow refused to stay quiet or private, and the letters had started arriving in bunches, 2 or 3 a week, occasionally more. His housekeeper Hattie had taken to stacking them on the corner of his desk without comment, which was Hattie's way of expressing disapproval without technically saying a word against it. He'd read every one of them. That surprised him, actually. He hadn't expected to. He'd expected to find a few that were obviously unsuitable, write polite responses, and be done with the whole thing. But he kept reading because something kept nagging at him, some vague dissatisfaction he couldn't quite name. The letters were, almost without exception, extremely well written, too well written. They described women who enjoyed long walks and sunsets, women who had always dreamed of the quiet beauty of ranch life, women who were warm and gentle and adaptable and possessed of a sunny disposition. One letter compared the correspondent to a morning glory. Another contained a pressed wildflower. Silas Mercer had run 8,000 acres of Montana ranch land for 20 years. He needed someone who could function inside a Montana winter, not someone who rhapsodized about sunsets. I was 42 years old, and he'd been a widower for 12 of those years, and he'd learned during those 12 years that almost everything came down to whether people were reliable when things were hard, not whether they were charming when things were easy, whether they stayed functional when the temperature dropped to 30 below, and the pipes froze, and the livestock needed tending, and there was no one to help and wouldn't be for days. He was 4 letters from the bottom of the stack. 44 letters read, 3 set aside as possibilities, none of them feeling quite right, when he found Nora Bellamy's. He read it straight through once. Then he set it down on the desk and looked at the window for a long moment. Then he picked it up and read it again. There was nothing impressive about it. It offered no particular beauty, no social grace, no promise of warmth and sunshine. What it offered was a completely unadorned accounting of a woman's actual capabilities, delivered with a kind of flat honesty that Silas hadn't encountered in the previous 44 letters. I know what I'm offering is not impressive, but it's real. And it's all entirely true. He sat with that sentence for a long time. In 12 years of managing a ranch the size of a small county, Silas Mercer had developed one skill above all others: the ability to tell the difference between people who were telling him what he wanted to hear and people who were telling him the truth. It wasn't a complicated skill. It didn't require brilliance. It just required having been fooled enough times that you started paying very close attention. He wrote back to Nora Bellamy the same evening. His letter was 3 paragraphs, plainly written, no pressed flowers. He told her what Mercer Ranch was, and what it required and what he was actually asking for, which was someone capable of running a large household and managing its staff, and not falling apart when the first Montana winter hit. He told her the position came with room and board, a reasonable wage, and complete respect for her privacy. He told her there would be no pressure of any kind beyond the work. Then he added one paragraph he hadn't planned. You wrote with unusual honesty. I want to be equally honest with you. I have read many letters from many women. Yours is the first one that sounded like a real person talking. That mattered to me more than I would have expected. He mailed it the next morning. 3 weeks later, Nora Bellamy stepped off a train in Ironwood, Montana, carrying a battered leather suitcase and wearing the blue dress she'd let out twice. She'd been awake since 4 in the morning. Her neck ached from sleeping upright in the train car. There was a stain on her left cuff she'd noticed somewhere in Wyoming and hadn't been able to do anything about. She stood on the platform in the cold Montana afternoon and looked around and thought, well, here we are then. She had spent a good portion of the 3-week train journey preparing herself for the expression she was going to see when Silas Mercer got a good look at her. She'd practiced staying steady for it. She'd told herself it wouldn't break anything essential, that she'd seen that expression before on Edwin Pike's face, and she'd survived it, and she'd survive it again. She had organized herself internally the way you organize a difficult room. Everything in its place, nothing exposed that didn't need to be. She spotted him immediately. It was hard to miss. Tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing work clothes rather than anything meant to impress, standing near the edge of the platform with his hat in his hands. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who spent most of his life outdoors doing difficult physical work. He was looking at her. She met his eyes and held them, because she'd learned long ago that looking away first made everything worse. He looked at her the way you look at a person you're trying to figure out, not appraising, not disappointed, just genuinely trying to read what was in front of him, as if she were a problem he was interested in solving. Then he walked over, picked up her suitcase. You must be tired, he said. That was all. No careful smile, no polite assessment, no rearranging of his expression to hide what he thought of her. Just, you must be tired, delivered in a voice that was simply stating an obvious fact and taking it seriously. Nora had been holding herself very carefully together for 3 weeks. Something about those 4 words, so plain, so utterly without ceremony, made her eyes sting in a way she absolutely refused to allow. She blinked twice, looked at the mountains in the distance, breathed through her nose. Train was slow through Wyoming, she said. Always is, he said. We'll get you fed and settled. He walked her to the wagon, and they drove through the early Montana evening, and she didn't say much, and neither did he, and the silence between them was, against all odds, not uncomfortable. She looked at the land around her, the scale of it, the way Montana simply didn't stop, the way the sky went on until it became something she didn't have a word for. And she thought about the Kansas kitchen where she'd written that terrifying letter. She thought about the moment she'd walked it to the mail station. She thought, whatever happens next, at least I told the truth. The wagon crested a low hill, and Mercer Ranch spread out below them in the fading light. The house was enormous. She hadn't quite believed the account she'd been given, but it was enormous. The kind of house built for a full family and a full life. Most of its windows were dark. It's bigger than I imagined, she said, before she could stop herself. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, It is. Most of it's empty. He said it the way you say true things that don't require decoration. Nora looked at the dark windows and the vast cold structure and felt something she hadn't expected. Not intimidation. something more like recognition. She'd spent 11 years in a house that was emptying out, room by room, as her mother slowly left it. She knew what empty felt like. She knew something else too. Though she wouldn't have said it out loud for anything, she thought she might know what it felt like to begin filling something back up. The wagon stopped. Silas climbed down and offered his hand for the step, a practical gesture, nothing more. And Nora took it. Her boots hit Montana dirt. She picked up her suitcase before he could reach it again. "I can carry it," she said. "I know," he said, "but you don't have to." She let him take it. And the kitchen door opened, and Hattie Crowell stood in the light with flour on her apron and an expression on her face that Nora had seen before. The expression of a woman who had been running things a long time and didn't see why that should change. And Nora thought, all right, so that's where we are. She straightened her spine. She walked through the door. And the house that had been empty for 12 years received her. Not warmly, not easily. The way a cold room receives a fire, with resistance first, and then, gradually, whether it wants to or not, with warmth. But that part would come later. For now, Nora Bellamy set her suitcase down on a stranger's floor, pushed up her sleeves, and looked at Hattie Crowell without flinching. "Tell me what needs doing," she said. Hattie looked at her for a long moment. Her expression didn't change, but she moved aside and let Nora into the kitchen. It wasn't much, but in that house, on that night, it was a start. Hattie Crowell did not warm to people quickly. That was not a flaw so much as a fact, the same way it was a fact that Montana winters were long, and that the Mercer Ranch well ran cold year-round. She had been housekeeper at Mercer Ranch for 14 years, had outlasted 2 hired girls and 1 cook, and a brief, disastrous experiment with a ranch manager who thought he knew better than everyone and lasted 4 months before Silas let him go. Hattie had survived all of it by being indispensable, and she had become indispensable by never doing anything halfway and never letting anyone else do it halfway either. And she saw absolutely no reason to change that approach now, simply because a plain-faced woman from Kansas had walked through her kitchen door carrying a suitcase and a look of determined calm that Hattie frankly didn't trust. She showed Nora to the small room off the back hallway that had been prepared. Clean sheets, a wash basin, a lamp that worked, and said, "Breakfast is at 5:30 for the hands, 6 for the house. Mr. Mercer takes his coffee black. I do the shopping on Thursdays." She said all of this the way someone recites the terms of an agreement they didn't write but are prepared to enforce, and then she left Nora alone with her suitcase and the sound of wind working its way under the doorframe. Nora sat on the edge of the bed. She was, if she was being honest with herself, more frightened than she'd been on the train. The train had been easy, in a way. She was moving toward something, which meant the fear had direction and purpose. Now she'd arrived. Now the thing was real. Now she had to actually be here, inside this cold, enormous house, with this woman who had looked at her like a problem that hadn't been solved correctly, and a man she'd exchanged exactly 2 letters and perhaps 40 words with in person, and a table full of ranch hands she hadn't met yet, and a Montana winter that hadn't even started in earnest. She unpacked her suitcase with methodical care. Dress hung up, spare boots on the floor, the small tin of salve she kept for dry hands and minor cuts set on the windowsill. The few books she'd brought arranged in size order on the narrow shelf, because having things in order when everything else was uncertain was one of the only comforts she allowed herself. Then she lay down on top of the covers without undressing and stared at the ceiling and told herself to sleep. She was awake at 4:45. She found the kitchen without trouble. She'd paid attention on the way through, and had the stove going and water heating, and the first batch of biscuit dough started before Hattie appeared in the doorway at 5:05, wearing an expression that managed to combine surprise with something that was not quite approval, but was at least a suspension of active disapproval. "I didn't tell you where anything was," Hattie said. "No," Nora agreed without looking up from the dough. "I found it." A long pause. "Coffee's in the tin on the second shelf." "Found that too." Another pause. Longer. Hattie came into the kitchen and began doing things she would have done regardless of whether anyone else was there, and Nora continued doing what she was doing, and for a while they worked in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was functional, which Nora counted as a reasonable beginning. The ranch hands came in at 5:30. There were 9 of them, ranging in age from a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, introduced by nobody in particular, as Pete, to a weathered man in his 50s named Cal, who walked with a slight list to the left that suggested an old injury. They came in stamping cold off their boots, talking to each other about things Nora didn't follow yet, and they sat down and looked at the plates in front of them, and then looked at Nora. She looked back. She didn't smile. She didn't try to introduce herself warmly or make a production of it. She just put more biscuits on the table and went back to the stove. Cal bit into a biscuit. He chewed. He reached for a second one without saying anything. Nora noticed but kept her face neutral. Pete ate 3 biscuits in roughly 2 minutes and then looked up with the unguarded appreciation of a teenage boy who had possibly not had a decent meal in some time. "These are real good," he said, to nobody in particular. "Eat slower," Cal told him. Silas came in at 6, as advertised. He'd clearly been working already. There was mud on his jacket and the particular focused tiredness of someone who's been up since before the cold fully settled. He poured his own coffee without asking where it was, sat at the far end of the table rather than the head of it, and ate without ceremony. He didn't comment on the food. He didn't comment on Nora's presence. He ate, drank his coffee, and left again inside of 15 minutes. Nora watched him go and thought, so that's the pattern of him. The first week was an education. She learned the shape of the house, which was considerable. 6 bedrooms on the upper floor, most of them sealed off and cold. A study that Silas disappeared into most evenings. A large front room with furniture that looked like it hadn't been used for its intended purpose in years. She learned the temperament of the stove, which ran hot on the right side and required watching. She learned that Pete had an unfortunate habit of forgetting to wipe his boots, and that Cal, despite his silent exterior, always thanked whoever put food in front of him, quietly, head down, as if gratitude was something private. She learned that Hattie Crowell had been the one who'd maintained what warmth remained in the ranch house through 14 years of Silas's self-sufficient grief, and she'd done it through sheer stubbornness, and she was not going to hand any piece of that responsibility to someone she didn't trust yet. Fair enough, Nora thought. I wouldn't either. She didn't push. She didn't try to take over. She did her portion of the work cleanly and without complaint, and she stayed out of Hattie's territory until she was invited in. It took longer than she would have liked, but on the 9th day, Hattie came to her and said, without preamble, "The bread's better when you make it." And that was the end of that particular Cold War. Not the end of all of them, but that one, at least. What she hadn't expected, what genuinely surprised her, in a way that she didn't quite know how to handle, was Silas. She had expected a man defined by grief, which he was. She had expected someone who kept people at a distance, which he also was. She had not expected someone who worked with such quiet, unrelenting competence that watching him was almost instructive. He didn't waste motion. He didn't perform authority. He knew his land and his animals and his people with the kind of bone-deep knowledge that only comes from years of actual attention, and he applied that knowledge without drama. She'd been there 11 days when she saw him manage a crisis. One of the younger horses had gotten into something it shouldn't have. Nora heard the commotion from the kitchen and came to the doorway and watched Silas go from standing still to moving in a single fluid second. Not running, exactly, but covering ground fast, his voice steady, already issuing instructions to 2 of the hands in a calm. That was not the calm of someone who wasn't worried, but the calm of someone who knew that panic was the most useless thing you could add to a bad situation. He handled it. The horse was going to be fine. The whole thing took maybe 30 minutes. When it was over, he came back through the side door with blood on his right hand. The horse had caught him when it startled, and he was heading toward the pump to rinse it when Nora said, "Come here." He stopped, turned, looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Your hand," she said. "Let me look at it." "It's fine. You haven't looked at it properly. Come here." Something about her tone, which was not soft, not particularly gentle, just matter-of-fact and direct. The same tone she'd used for 11 years with a woman who argued about taking her medicine, made him cross the kitchen and hold out his hand without further protest. It was a decent cut. Long, not deep, but dirty. She cleaned it with the efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times, which she had, and she was binding it with clean cloth when she said, without planning to, "You do that a lot." "Do what?" "Take care of everyone and everything on this land except yourself." She felt him go still. Not tense. Still. The difference mattered. She tied off the cloth and let go of his hand. It'll be sore for a few days. Don't get it wet if you can avoid it. Silas looked down at the bandage for a moment. Then he looked up at her with that expression she still couldn't fully read, as if she'd said something in a language he recognized but hadn't heard spoken in a long time. "Thank you," he said. He left. Nora turned back to the stove. Her hands were not entirely steady. She gripped the spoon handle a little tighter and focused on the pot, and told herself firmly that this was not something she was going to think about. But she thought about it anyway, later, lying awake in her narrow room listening to the wind. She thought about the way he'd held still. Not because he trusted her, not yet, not exactly, but because some part of him recognized an offer of care and didn't quite know how to refuse it. She'd seen that before, in her mother, in the last years when Ruth Bellamy's stubbornness had softened just enough to let someone in. The look of a person who has been managing alone for so long that being looked after has become almost startling. She was careful after that. She didn't push further. She didn't try to manufacture more moments like that one. But she paid attention in a way she hadn't let herself pay attention before, and what she saw over the following weeks was a man who had built his entire life around being necessary to other people, and had simply never turned any of that necessity back toward himself. The table was where things began to shift, and she hadn't planned that either. It started with the biscuits, Cal reaching for a second one, then a third, then starting to say something to Pete across the table about the state of the east fence, which was not a conversation Pete particularly wanted to have, but which kept them both at the table an extra few minutes. Then it became the soup she made from whatever was left near the end of a week, which was legitimately good soup, the kind her mother used to make when money was tight, built on bones and late vegetables and patience. Ranch hands who had previously eaten in under 10 minutes started sitting for 15, then 20. Pete started asking questions that weren't entirely about food, asking what something was called, how she'd made it, in the awkward way of a young person who is curious but doesn't want to appear too curious. She answered without making a fuss of it. Hattie noticed. Hattie noticed everything, but this she noticed with particular attention. And one evening she came to stand beside Nora at the stove and said quietly, so that no one else could hear, "Pete hasn't talked that much at meals since his first week here." "He's hungry for more than food," Nora said. "Most people are." Hattie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "His mother died 2 years ago." "He doesn't say that, but I know." Nora nodded. She'd suspected something like that from the way he watched her sometimes. Not with any particular feeling she could name, just watching, the way a young person watches someone who reminds them of a space that used to be filled. She didn't say anything about it to Pete. She just made sure there were always extra biscuits. It was the end of the 4th week when Silas appeared in the kitchen after everyone else had gone. He did it the way people do things they're not entirely sure about, with a reason attached, a practical justification that gives you an exit if you need one. He came in saying he needed to check the stove flue for a blockage that someone had mentioned, and he checked it, and it was fine, and then he stood there with his coffee cup, like a man who has walked into a room and is now trying to remember what he came for. Nora was doing accounts at the kitchen table. She had Hattie's household ledger spread out in front of her. Hattie had asked her to look over the numbers because the supply costs had been running high, and Nora had a knack for that kind of thing. And she had a pencil behind her ear, and she didn't look up right away because she was in the middle of a column, and she preferred to finish what she was doing. Silas refilled his coffee cup, sat down at the far end of the table. She finished her column, noted the figure, turned the page. "The feed merchant's been charging you 15 cents more per hundredweight than market price," she said, "for about 8 months by these records." A pause. "You sure?" "I checked it twice. I can show you." He came around the table and looked where she was pointing, following her pencil as she walked him through it. I was close enough that she was aware of him in the slightly uncomfortable way you become aware of a person when they're near enough to see clearly. He smelled like work and cold air and coffee. Not unpleasant. "I'll talk to Hendricks," he said. "You might check the lumber account, too. 3rd quarter looks off." He straightened up, looked at her. "You found that just now going through Hattie's records? It's not hard if you know what to look for. Hattie's been keeping those books for 6 years. She's excellent at managing a household. Accounting isn't the same skill." Silas was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding something, though she couldn't tell what. Then he sat back down at the far end of the table with his coffee and said, "My wife used to say that running a ranch was 9 parts management and 1 part actual ranching. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife. Nora kept her eyes on the ledger. She understood, without him having to say so, that this was not an easy thing he'd said. She treated it accordingly, didn't make it into something large, didn't offer a response that would require him to go further than he'd intended. She was right, Nora said. The management is the hard part. Clara was good at it, he said, and then, as if that was all he had to say on the subject, he drank his coffee and looked at the table. I'm sorry, Nora said. Simple. No decoration. 12 years ago, he said. You'd think... He stopped, started again. You'd think by now it would just be a fact, like the weather. Grief doesn't work like weather, Nora said. Weather changes. Grief just gets quieter. He looked at her. She looked back. That's true, he said slowly, as if he was testing the sentence against something he knew. That's actually true. He left a little while after that. Nora went back to the accounts. Her handwriting was slightly less neat for the next page and a half. The note appeared on a Wednesday morning, mid-November, slid under the kitchen door while the household was still sleeping. Nora found it at 4:50 when she came down to start the stove. It was written on a torn piece of paper in handwriting that was trying to disguise itself. Slightly too careful, slightly too anonymous. Everyone in Ironwood knows you were turned away by a decent man in Kansas. Mercer doesn't know what kind of woman he's brought into his house. Maybe someone should tell him. She stood in the cold kitchen holding that piece of paper for a long time. Not because it shook her, or not only because of that, but because she recognized the architecture of it, the way it was designed to do maximum damage with minimum exposure, slid under a door at night by someone who didn't have the courage to say it out loud. She'd seen that architecture before. Edwin Pike had sent his letter the same way, politely, the coward's version of cruelty. She folded the note, put it in her apron pocket, started the stove. She didn't tell Silas, she didn't tell Hattie. She went about her morning the same way she went about every morning. And when Pete came in stamping cold off his boots, she gave him his biscuits. And when Cal sat down and said his quiet thank you, she nodded, and when Silas came in for his coffee, she poured it without flinching. She thought, whoever wrote that note wanted her to flinch. She refused. But something in the valley had changed, and she felt it over the following days the way you feel a change in the weather before it arrives. A certain quality in the air, a tension in small things. She went to town with Hattie for the Thursday shopping and noticed how the conversation at the general store shifted slightly when she walked in. Nothing dramatic, just a certain realignment of who was talking to whom, a slight lowering of voices, the specific quality of attention that meant she was being discussed rather than greeted. Hattie noticed too. She came out of the store with her chin at a particular angle and didn't say anything until they'd loaded the wagon and pulled back onto the road, and then she said flatly, "There's talk." "About me," Nora said. Not a question. "About whether Silas made a poor choice." Hattie looked straight ahead. "You should know there's always been talk about this ranch, about whether he'd remarry, about who'd be suitable. Some people have opinions." "I imagine they do." "The widow Calder has been mentioned." Hattie said it the way you say something you've been carrying around long enough that putting it down is a relief. Vivian Calder, from Denver. She knew Clara. Nora absorbed this. "Is she coming here?" "Word is she's already written to Silas." A long pause. The wagon wheels found a rough patch in the road. "Thank you for telling me," Nora said. Hattie glanced at her sideways. "I'm not telling you to worry you. I'm telling you because you should know what you're dealing with." "I appreciate that." "Also," Hattie added, and this part was said with slightly more difficulty, as if it cost her something, "whatever that note was that someone left under the kitchen door, because I know one was left, I found the dirt from the boot that left it. You handled it correctly, saying nothing and getting on with the work." Nora looked at her. Hattie was still looking straight ahead. Her jaw was set in the particular way of a woman who has said something personal and is not going to make a thing of it. "It's what you do," Nora said. "It's what some people do," Hattie said. "Not everyone." That was all. But that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, Hattie poured herself a cup of tea and then, without asking, poured one for Nora as well, and sat back down. Nora sat across from her. They drank their tea. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. But somewhere in the time it took them to finish those 2 cups, something between them settled into a different shape. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but the solid, unspoken agreement between two women who have recognized in each other someone who will not crumble when things get difficult. Nora thought about Vivian Calder. She thought about the voice behind the anonymous note and the particular way that conversation had shifted in the general store. She thought about Edwin Pike and the expression he'd had when he'd looked at her and the polite letter that came 9 days later. She had run from none of it then. She was not going to run from it now. She told herself, whatever happens Friday, I will still be here on Saturday. It was a small promise, made only to herself, in the kitchen of a house that was not yet hers. But she made it the way she made most promises, without decoration and without the slightest intention of breaking it. The cold deepened that week. Montana had been easing into winter the way it sometimes did, taking its time, and then in the span of 3 days it arrived properly, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees, and the hands came in from the morning work with frost in their beards, and the horses in the barn breathed visible clouds in the stall air. Nora made elk stew on the Thursday, because Hattie had shown her where the meat was stored and told her the hands would need something that stayed warm. And she made enough that there was still some in the pot when Silas came in late, later than usual, his face tight from a day that had not gone exactly as planned. Something about a fence line and a dispute with a neighboring property that she gathered from fragments of Cal's report delivered in the hallway outside the kitchen. He sat at the table and she put the bowl in front of him and he ate without preamble, and she was about to go back to the counter when he said, "Sit down, if you're not busy." She wasn't. She sat. He ate for a moment. Then, "You've been here 5 weeks. Close enough." "It's different," he said. He was looking at the bowl, not at her. "The house. Since you've been here." She waited. "The men linger at the table," he said. Hattie started talking again. Actually talking, not just reporting what needs doing. He paused. "I don't know if that's you or just—" He stopped, started differently. "I noticed it is all." Nora thought about how to answer this and settled on something close to the truth. "People get used to being somewhere that feels empty," she said. "They start treating it like it's supposed to be that way. You change the temperature of a room, they need time to realize they can put down whatever they'd been using to keep warm on their own." Silas looked up from his bowl. She realized, a beat too late, that she might have said more than she intended. But he wasn't looking at her the way people sometimes looked at her when she said things too directly, with the slight stiffening that meant she'd overstepped. I was looking at her the way he'd looked at her when she'd said, "Grief just gets quieter," like he was testing it against something internal and finding it accurate. "Where did you learn to say things like that?" he asked. 11 years in a sick room," she said. "You run out of anything but the true thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been running this ranch for 20 years, he said. "I know how to manage land and animals and men. I have never once figured out how to—" He stopped again. "How to make a place feel like it's worth coming back to." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind hit the side of the house with a sound like something leaning. "You come back every night," Nora said. "I come back because I have to." "Not the same thing," she said. "But it's a start." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in him shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, just a very slight easing of the tension he carried in his jaw and shoulders. The way a man relaxes when he's put something down he didn't realize he'd been holding. He finished his stew. "Thank you," he said, "for this." He gestured vaguely at the bowl, the kitchen, something larger than either. "All of it." "It's what I came to do," she said. "I know," he said, "but it still deserves thanking." He pushed back from the table and went to the hallway, and she heard his boots on the stairs. And when he was gone, she sat alone in the kitchen for a few minutes, in the warm, close air of a room that now smelled like stew and wood smoke and bread. She thought about the note under the door, and the talk in the general store, and the widow from Denver who had known Clara Mercer and would arrive, she suspected, before the month was out. She thought about all of it with a steady, practical clarity. Then she got up and washed the dishes, and banked the stove for the night and went to her room. She fell asleep without lying awake first, which had not happened since she arrived. It wasn't much, but she'd learned to take what was real over what was impressive. And this? The sleeping, the stew, the brief conversation, the 2 cups of tea with Hattie, the biscuits that made Pete sit a little longer at the table. This was real. Whatever came next, and something was coming, she could feel it in the particular way trouble always announced itself. Quietly, at first, from a distance. She would face it the same way she'd faced everything else. She'd get up before 4:45. She'd start the stove. She'd be here on Saturday. Vivian Calder arrived on a Friday, which Nora would later think was fitting, because Friday was the day she had decided to measure herself against. She came in a hired carriage rather than the supply wagon, which said something about how she saw herself relative to the valley. She was 40 years old and looked 35, which was the particular luck of women who had always had enough money to eat well and sleep well and not spend their days in a Kansas wind. Her coat was dark green wool, good quality, the kind that held its shape. Her hair was arranged in a way that suggested both effort and the appearance of effortlessness, which is its own kind of skill. Nora was in the kitchen when she heard the carriage, and she stayed in the kitchen because there was bread in the oven that needed watching, and because going to the door to look would have been the act of a woman who was worried, and she was not, she told herself this firmly, worried. She heard Silas's voice in the front hall. Then a woman's voice, warm and practiced, the voice of someone accustomed to making rooms feel immediately comfortable. Then Hattie's voice, shorter, giving direction about bags. Then nothing for a while as they moved to the front parlor, the room with the furniture that hadn't been used for its intended purpose in years. Nora pulled her bread from the oven. She met Vivian Calder at dinner. Silas had said simply, at 4 o'clock, appearing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, in the way he had when he wasn't sure how to say something, "Mrs. Calder will be joining us for supper. She'll be staying a few days." "I'll set another place," Nora said. "She was a close friend of Clara's," he added. As if that explained something, as if it required explaining. "I know," Nora said. "Hattie mentioned." He stood there a moment longer. "It's not—" He stopped. Tried again. "It's a courtesy. She wrote, and I couldn't—" He stopped again, and Nora understood what he was not saying. He couldn't refuse without being unkind, and he was not a man who was unkind to people without very good reason, and a woman who had been his late wife's friend asking to visit was not sufficient reason. "It's your house," Nora said. "You don't need to explain." He looked at her. "I know I don't," he said. "I wanted to anyway." He left. Nora stared at the bread cooling on the rack for a moment. Then she set another place at the table. Vivian Calder, it turned out, was not the enemy Nora had spent a week quietly bracing for. She was something more complicated than that. She was a genuinely intelligent woman who happened to want something that Nora also happened to want, and who had reasons for wanting it that were almost entirely legitimate. She was kind at dinner, pointedly, deliberately kind, in the way of a woman who has decided that being gracious costs her nothing and establishes her position more effectively than being cold. She complimented the bread, and she meant it, Nora could tell, because she had a second piece without being offered it. She asked Silas about the ranch with the ease of someone who had asked similar questions before and genuinely remembered the answers. She asked Hattie about her health, with what appeared to be actual concern. She didn't speak directly to Nora for most of the meal. That itself was a statement. It wasn't hostile. It was considered. Vivian Calder had sized up the situation with the particular speed of a woman who has had to size up situations her entire life, and she had made a calculation. Engage the help directly, and you grant her equal standing at the table. Ignore her, and you establish the natural order without saying a word about it. Nora ate her dinner. She answered when Silas included her in conversation, which he did twice, deliberately. She noticed that too. She did not perform comfort she didn't feel, and she did not perform distress she wasn't going to let herself feel either. After dinner, Hattie and Nora cleared the table, and when Nora came back from the kitchen for the last of the dishes, she caught the tail end of something Vivian was saying to Silas in the low, carefully modulated voice of someone who is being private while remaining aware that privacy in a ranch house is approximate at best. "No, you must be lonely, Silas. That's natural." Clara would have understood that. But she also would have wanted you to think carefully about— Nora didn't hear the rest. She went back to the kitchen and put the dishes in the basin and pressed her hands flat against the rim of the counter and breathed carefully through her nose for a count of 5. Then she washed the dishes. Hattie came in a few minutes later. She didn't say anything. She picked up a cloth and dried what Nora washed, and they worked together in the kind of silence that had by now become its own form of communication between them. "She's not wrong that he's lonely," Nora said, eventually, because it was true and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. No, Hattie agreed. She might even be good for him. The words cost something. Nora said them anyway because she had spent 11 years being honest with herself about hard things, and she wasn't going to stop now. Hattie put down a dry plate with a precise, deliberate motion. She might be, she said, or she might be a woman who's been comfortable in Denver for 10 years and is looking for a reason to be comfortable somewhere larger and more interesting. She picked up another plate. I knew Clara. Clara was warm straight through. Vivian was her friend, but she was always more, she searched for the word, more organized about her feelings than Clara was. Nora thought about that. She's been here 4 hours, Nora said. I shouldn't make judgments. No, Hattie said. But I've known her 11 years and I can. She put the last plate away and folded her cloth with the neat finality of someone who has said exactly what she intended to say, and not a word more. The next 3 days were a particular kind of difficult. Vivienne didn't do anything wrong exactly. She was helpful in small, visible ways, offering to assist with arrangements, suggesting improvements that were sensible, telling stories about Clara at moments that brought a complicated look to Silas's face that Nora could not read and did not try to. She occupied the front parlor with a naturalness that suggested she had always belonged there, and she drew Silas into conversation with a practiced ease that Nora, watching from the kitchen doorway or the end of the hall, recognized as genuine skill. She was good at this. There was no use pretending she wasn't. What she was not particularly good at, or chose not to be, was acknowledging Nora as someone with standing in the house. She did it in small ways, the kind that are very hard to name without sounding petty, asking Hattie questions that Nora could have answered, referring to the kitchen as if it were a part of the house unconnected to any particular person's labor. At dinner on the second night, in a conversation about the difficulty of managing a large household, she said, lightly, pleasantly, without a hint of edge, "Of course, it must be different when you have real staff, someone with actual household management experience." The table went briefly quiet. Silas looked up. Nora finished chewing what was in her mouth, set down her fork, looked at Vivian with a directness that she didn't soften. "I've been managing a household since I was 14, she said. Not a house this size, but one where the margin for error was smaller. When you can't afford to waste anything, you learn to manage well." Vivian smiled. "Of course," she said. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant," Nora said pleasantly, and turned back to her plate. Cal, at the other end of the table, appeared to be examining his stew with great concentration. Pete's ears had gone slightly red. Hattie was doing the thing with her chin. Silas said, into the silence, "The bread tonight is better than yesterday's, and yesterday's was the best I've had in years." Nora looked at him. He was looking at his plate, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that, on another man's face, might have been a smile. It was the evening of the third day that things between Nora and Vivian actually came to a head, and it happened in the way things do when two people who have been circling each other finally find themselves alone. Nora had come to the back porch for the nightly airing that she'd made a habit of, 10 minutes outside before bed, in the cold, because it helped her sleep. She hadn't expected company, and Vivian clearly hadn't either. They both stopped when they saw each other. Then Vivian said, "I'll go in." And Nora said, "You don't have to." And for a moment they looked at each other with the honesty that comes when there's nobody else watching. "You love him," Vivian said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't kind or unkind. It was just stated, the way you state something you've observed and needed to name. Nora's first instinct was to deny it. Her second instinct was to say something practical and deflecting. Her third instinct was the one she followed, which was to say nothing for a moment and simply be honest with herself about whether Vivian was right. She was right. Nora had known it for some time, in the way you know things you've been carefully not knowing. It had been there in the unsteadiness of her hands when she'd wrapped his cut, in the way his brief moments of ease in the evenings had become something she found herself working toward, in the feeling that had settled into her chest on the night he'd said she'd changed the temperature of the house. "That," Nora said carefully, "is not something I planned." "No," Vivian said. "I don't imagine it was." She leaned against the porch rail. The cold was sharp and clean. "I want you to understand something. I'm not here to be cruel to you. I am not that kind of woman." "I don't think you are," Nora said, because it was true. "I knew Clara for 20 years. I watched what her death did to him. I watched him close everything down until he was just functional, Surviving. She paused. I thought perhaps if I came here, if he had someone who understood who he'd been before all that. You thought you could reach him, Nora said. Yes. A pause. But he's not the same man I remember. She stopped, seemed to be deciding something. He laughed at dinner 2 nights ago. I hadn't heard Silas Mercer laugh in 12 years. She looked at Nora. That wasn't me. Nora didn't say anything. You've done something here, Vivian said, and this time there was no pleasantness performed over the top of it, just the flat acknowledgement of one woman to another. Whatever you are to him right now, something has changed in him. I can see it. He's changed it himself, Nora said. I just stopped moving the furniture out of his way. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone more eager. Someone trying harder to look like she belonged here. I do belong here, Nora said. And then, because she was still honest even when honesty was uncomfortable, or I'm trying to, which might be the same thing in the end, Vivian was quiet. The wind moved between them. I won't stay longer than the week, she said finally. I want you to know that. She pushed away from the rail. I also want you to know that whatever that note was, yes, I heard about it, this valley talks. Whoever sent it is a coward, and you're better than they wanted you to feel. She went inside. Nora stood on the porch alone in the dark and the cold and thought about what had just happened, which was not what she'd expected at all. She was still standing there 5 minutes later when the door opened again, and it was Silas, which also was not what she'd expected. He stood next to her at the rail. He didn't ask what she was doing or how long she'd been there. He just stood, which was something she'd learned about him. He didn't fill silences for the sake of filling them. Cold tonight, he said eventually. Yes. You should sleep. I know. He didn't move. Neither did she. The stars over Montana were the kind that Kansas stars, for all their visibility, could never quite manage. A depth to them, a distance that made you feel both very small and very specifically located, which was a strange combination of feelings. Vivian told me she's leaving at the end of the week, he said. I know, Nora said. She told me too. A pause. She talked to you? She did. What did she say? Nora thought about how to answer this. She said she heard Silas Mercer laugh 2 nights ago and hadn't heard that in 12 years. I was quiet for a while. She didn't mention how terrible the joke was. Nora looked at him. He was looking at the stars. What joke? Pete was trying to explain why the fence post he put in was crooked. His explanation involved 3 separate accidents and 1 mule with a particular attitude. By the time he got to the mule, I couldn't... He stopped. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't even a good story. You don't need good stories, Nora said. You just need to stop bracing for bad ones. He turned to look at her. Full, this time, not a glance. The particular look he had when he was paying genuine attention. You do that, he said. Do what? Say the exactly right thing without appearing to try very hard. 11 years, she said. I told you. You run out of anything but the true thing. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at the sky. There's something I should tell you, he said, and the tone of it made Nora's stomach drop in the particular way it dropped when she sensed that something important was coming and she didn't know from which direction. All right, she said. Someone in town has written to a man in Kansas, a merchant named Pike. He said the name carefully, without inflection, watching her. I don't know who, but there's going to be a letter from him, or already is. Nora went very still. How do you know that? She asked. Cal heard it at the feed store. He told me. A pause. He didn't want to, but he thought I should know. Nora processed this. Edwin Pike writing a letter to Ironwood Valley was not a possibility she hadn't considered. She had considered it the way you consider all the bad things that might happen, and then she'd set it aside because worrying about it hadn't seemed useful. Now it was no longer a possibility. It was a fact, or nearly one. You should know what he'll say, she said, because there was no point in not. You don't have to... I know I don't. She said it the same way he'd said it to her once, in the same kitchen, about carrying her own suitcase. But I'd rather you heard it from me. She breathed out into the cold. He courted me through letters. I thought it was serious. He came to meet me and decided it wasn't. Sent me a polite letter 9 days later. She paused. That's all that happened. But however he tells that story, it will not be that simple. Silas was looking at her. She could feel it without turning. He'll say I pursued him for money, she said, or that I behaved badly when he ended it, or something else that makes him look reasonable and makes me look less than I am. Is any of it true? No. She said it flat and clear. None of it. Then that's what I needed to know, he said. She turned to look at him. His face in the dark was difficult to read, but what she could see wasn't what she'd feared. It wasn't doubt or caution or the careful recalculating of a man who was reconsidering something. It was just steadiness. The same steadiness he'd brought to the horse in the yard, to the cut on his hand, to every difficult thing she'd watched him manage. It won't be comfortable when the letter comes, she said. A lot of things aren't comfortable, he said. That doesn't make them decisive. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. He went inside a minute later. Nora stayed on the porch until the cold became impractical, and then she went inside too, and she did not lie awake, and she did not let herself spiral into the particular anxiety of anticipating something she couldn't yet do anything about. She slept. She was up at 4:45. The letter from Edwin Pike arrived on a Tuesday, which felt, to Nora, like an echo she could have done without. It came through the general post rather than directly to Silas, which meant it made its way through the post office at Ironwood with the particular speed of gossip attached to anything that looks like it might be interesting. By the time Silas held it in his hands, Nora had already fielded a look from the woman at the dry goods counter that told her the contents were at least partially known. She was in the kitchen when Silas read it. She didn't know for certain that he was reading it at that moment. She couldn't see the study from the kitchen, but she felt it the way you feel certain things when you're paying close enough attention to a house and its silences. The quality of the quiet in the study was different. She made bread. She was on the second kneading when Silas came into the kitchen. He put the letter on the counter beside her. He didn't say anything. He poured himself coffee and stood with his back against the counter and his arms loosely crossed, and he waited. She read it with floury hands. As she'd predicted, not simple. Edwin Pike had not been crude about it. He'd been worse than crude. He'd been plausible. He'd written about their correspondence with a particular framing, the framing of a man who'd been pressured by an unsuitable woman and had gently and regretfully extricated himself. He'd used the word character twice. He'd referenced her financial situation in a way that suggested she'd been pursuing him for relief rather than companionship. He'd wished Silas well in what he called a difficult position. She put the letter down. She went back to kneading. Well, she said, her voice was steady. That's worse than I expected and about what I should have. He's lying, Silas said. Mostly, she said. The financial situation wasn't wrong. I was in a difficult situation. Whether I was looking for relief, she pressed her palms into the dough. I was looking for a life. Those aren't the same thing, but they're close enough that he can make them sound the same. Nora. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something had moved in it. Not anger exactly, though there was something near anger somewhere in it. More like a kind of resolving, the way a thing comes into focus when you've been looking at it from the wrong distance. I know who you are, he said. I've watched you work in this house for 6 weeks. I know what kind of person you are from the inside of a day, not from a letter from a man I've never met who has every reason to protect his own account. Nora's hand stopped moving. I'm going to write back to him, Silas said. I'm going to do it today. You don't have to. I know I don't, he said. Again. Her own words back at her, a third time now, and she recognized that he'd been doing that deliberately for a while. Taking the words she used to relieve him of obligation and using them to decline the relief. I want to. He left the kitchen. Nora stood at the counter and breathed carefully for a moment. Then she finished the bread. What Silas wrote to Edwin Pike she didn't read, and he didn't offer to show her. What she knew was that he wrote it and mailed it the same day, and that whatever it contained, it took Edwin Pike's careful constructed narrative and publicly declined to accept it. She knew this because Cal told her in his brief, low-key way at dinner 3 days later. Mr. Mercer's letter got around, he said, not looking up from his plate, the way things do. What did people think of it? Pete asked, with the directness of the young. I think, Cal said, that when a man like Silas Mercer puts his name on something and says it plainly, People in this valley tend to listen. Hattie said nothing, but she refilled Nora's cup without being asked. It would have been enough, probably, if it had stopped there. It didn't stop there. The trouble that had been building quietly in Ironwood Valley decided, in the way of troubles that have been quiet too long, to become loud. It started with a man named Douglas Pratt, who was one of the more established landowners in the valley, and who had, by various accounts, been of the opinion for some time that Silas Mercer spent too little time engaged in the social fabric of the community and too much time running a ranch he could presumably run with his eyes closed. Douglas Pratt was the kind of man who considered himself a custodian of community standards, which meant he was the kind of man who made those standards serve whatever he'd already decided to think. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, uninvited, and Nora happened to be the one who answered the door because Hattie was at the back of the house and Silas was out in the east field. I was a broad man, well-dressed for a ranch visit, with the particular bearing of someone who expects doors to open for him and is mildly surprised when they do it without more ceremony. He looked at Nora with a frankness that was almost insulting. "You're the woman Mercer brought in," he said. "I'm Nora Bellamy," she said. "Mr. Mercer is in the east field. I can send someone to fetch him." "I'll wait." He stepped inside without being invited, in the way of men who are accustomed to their own welcome. "I'd like to speak to him about some concerns the community has raised." "Concerns," Nora said, "about the situation here." He said it with a particular kind of tact that was barely tact at all. A man in Silas's position has responsibilities. Social responsibilities, as well as practical ones. The valley watches how he conducts himself. "I imagine it does," Nora said. "A hasty arrangement—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider the word. "An unconventional arrangement can create difficulties for everyone involved." Nora looked at him. She kept her face neutral with the practice of someone who had been keeping her face neutral since she was 14 years old, and her aunt had started in with the comments about how she looked. "Would you like something to drink while you wait?" she said. Douglas Pratt blinked. He had, she thought, expected something other than complete ordinary courtesy. "Coffee," he said after a moment. "I'll bring it to the sitting room," she said, and went to the kitchen. She brought him his coffee. She did not wait in the room with him. She went back to what she'd been doing, which was mending a tear in one of Pete's work shirts because Pete had mentioned it, and nobody else had gotten to it, and a shirt not mended became a shirt ruined. She was finishing the mend when she heard the front door and Silas coming down the hall, and then the low exchange of voices from the sitting room. She couldn't make out words, but she could track the shape of the conversation by its rhythm and tone, and what she tracked was Pratt talking in the measured way of a man presenting a prepared argument, Silas listening, Silas responding briefly, then a longer response from Pratt, then a longer response from Silas, and then a very long silence. Then Pratt leaving. She did not hear what was said. She found out from Silas that evening, when he came to the kitchen after supper, which was his habit now. Their habit, she realized, which had somehow become a thing between them without being formally established. He sat at the table. She poured his coffee. "Pratt came about you," he said. "I know. He told me as much while he was waiting." Silas looked up. "He spoke to you about it?" "He was careful about it, but yes." Silas set down his cup. The expression on his face was the one she associated with him being angry, but not going to perform the anger. "What did you say?" "I offered him coffee." A beat. "That's all?" "I thought it was more useful than arguing," she said. "He wasn't going to listen to me. You were the only person whose opinion mattered to him." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "I told him that you are a capable and decent woman who has made this household function better in 6 weeks than it has in a decade, and that my business is my business, and that if the Valley has concerns about who I choose to have in my home, the Valley can direct those concerns somewhere they'll receive more attention." Nora absorbed this. "Was he—" "He was not pleased," Silas said. "He'll make trouble about it." "Probably," she agreed. "I don't care," he said. He said it simply, the way he said most things, without performing the sentiment. "I want to be clear about that. I want you to know that I haven't survived 20 years of difficult seasons and difficult men and a grief that would have leveled most people just to let Douglas Pratt's opinion of my household arrangements make me doubt what I know to be true." Nora looked at him. "What do you know to be true?" she asked. Her voice was very quiet. The kitchen was still. Outside, wind against the house, that familiar leaning sound. He looked at her across the table, across the ledger books and the mended shirt, and the 2 coffee cups and everything that had accumulated between them over 6 weeks of actual days. That you belong here, he said. That whatever this house was before you arrived, it's something else now, something worth... He stopped. Started differently. I've been coming home to an empty house for 12 years, not empty of people, empty of something I didn't have a name for. And now I do. Nora's hands were flat on the table. Silas, she said, and then stopped because she wasn't sure what came after his name. I'm not asking you anything yet, he said quickly, as if he'd heard the caution in her voice and wanted to address it before it became a wall. I just needed you to know where I stand, before whatever comes next from Pratt, or from the Valley, or from anywhere else. He held her gaze. You needed to know that whatever they say about you, my position is not going to shift. She looked at him for a long moment. That matters to me, she said, more than I know how to say. You don't have to say it, he said. You got up before 5 this morning and made food for 12 people and fixed a boy's shirt that nobody asked you to fix and stood in your kitchen and gave an angry man his coffee without flinching. He picked up his cup. You say things all day long. You just say them with what you do instead of with words. Nora Bellamy, who had not cried on the morning her mother died, who had read Edwin Pike's letter in a cold kitchen without making a sound, who had stepped off a train in a strange state and walked into a house full of people who had every reason not to trust her and had gotten on with it anyway, felt something in the back of her throat that she was not going to allow to become anything visible. You should sleep, she said. You were in the East Field since early. I know, he said. He finished his coffee, stood up, paused at the kitchen door with his hand on the frame, the way he sometimes paused, as if there was something he was considering adding. He didn't add it, but the way he didn't add it was different from the way he used to not add things. It had changed quality. The silences between them had changed quality, all of them, gradually, without being announced. From the silence of 2 strangers figuring out how to coexist to something that held weight without pressing. He went upstairs. Nora washed the cups and banked the stove and went to her room. And outside, the valley was talking, the way valleys talk, in layers, in whispers, in the slow accumulation of opinion that builds like snow on a fence rail, piling up until something either holds the weight or bends. Nora lay in her bed and listened to the wind and thought, there is more coming. She could feel it in the particular way trouble announces itself. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the specific tightening of everything just before the break. She thought, I have been afraid of the break my whole life. Then she thought, but every fence line I've ever seen that went down in the wind had to be rebuilt. And the rebuilt ones, if you did it right, held better the second time. She closed her eyes. She would be up at 4:45. She would still be here on Saturday. That was enough for tonight. The trouble Douglas Pratt had promised arrived the following week in the form of a gathering at the Ironwood Valley Community Hall that was not officially about Nora Bellamy, but was, in the way of all such gatherings, entirely about Nora Bellamy. She found out about it from Pete, who had heard it from a hand at the neighboring Alderson property, who had heard it directly from Pratt's foreman. The gathering was framed as a community discussion about standards and conduct, language that meant exactly what it sounded like and nothing it pretended to be. Pete told her at breakfast on a Thursday, not looking at her directly, turning his cup around in his hands. I thought you should know, he said, in case Mr. Mercer doesn't mention it. Does he know? Cal told him last night. Nora nodded. She put more biscuits on the table. Eat, she said. You've got fence work today, and you'll need it. Pete ate, but he kept his eyes on her in the way of a young person who has decided someone is worth paying attention to and isn't sure yet how to say so without it being awkward. Silas said nothing to her about the gathering at breakfast. He said nothing at supper. He came to the kitchen that evening and sat at the table with his coffee, and she was doing the week's accounts. And for a while neither of them mentioned it, which was, she was learning, sometimes how Silas handled things he was working through. He carried them in silence until he knew what shape they were. You've heard about Thursday, he said. Pete told me. Cal told me. He set down his cup. I'm going. I expected you would. I want you to come. Nora looked up from the ledger. He was looking at her steadily. I'm not asking you to defend yourself, he said. I'm asking you to be there. standing next to me, so that whatever gets said, the valley sees that I'm not keeping you somewhere out of sight while men discuss your character." Nora thought about this. She thought about the community hall in Douglas Pratt and the kind of people who gather to discuss a woman they've decided is inconvenient. She thought about the conversation with Vivian on the porch and the look on the dry goods woman's face and the anonymous note under the kitchen door. She thought about a promise she'd made to herself. "Whatever happens Friday, I will still be here on Saturday." "All right," she said. "You don't have to." "I know," she said. "I want to." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not frightened?" It wasn't quite a question. "I'm frightened," she said. "I'm just not going to let that be the deciding thing." Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, but the quiet version of something that might have been one, deep enough to be genuine. "Wear the gray dress," he said. "Not because it matters what you wear, just you look more yourself in the gray." She stared at him. He picked up his coffee and looked at the table. The tips of his ears, she noticed for the first time, had gone slightly red. "Good night," he said, and left the kitchen with somewhat more speed than usual. Nora sat at the table for a moment, looking at the doorway where he'd been. Then she looked down at the accounts. The column she'd been adding blurred slightly. She blinked, refocused, added the column. Her handwriting was not as neat as usual for the next 3 pages. The community hall in Ironwood was a plain building, wood-framed, practical, built by people who needed somewhere to gather and didn't have time to make it beautiful. On a normal Thursday evening, it hosted meetings about water rights and fence disputes, and occasionally a traveling preacher. On this particular Thursday, it was 3/4 full by the time Silas and Nora arrived, which meant the gathering had drawn people from neighboring properties who had made the trip specifically for this. Nora walked in next to Silas, and she felt the room before she could see most of it. The specific quality of attention that is different from curiosity, heavier, with an edge to it. She had felt that quality before, in the general store, in the post office, in small moments she'd been filing away without letting herself react to. She held herself straight, not stiff, straight. There was a difference. Silas put his hand briefly at the small of her back as they moved through the doorway. One light touch, nothing dramatic, there and then gone. But it was seen. She knew it was seen because she heard the shift in ambient sound, the very slight drop in reorganization of conversations happening around them. Cal was already there, near the back wall, with 2 of the other hands. He gave Nora a single nod that she understood to mean, "We're here." Hattie had not come. Hattie had said, at supper, with the precision of a woman who has decided exactly how much involvement is appropriate and not a fraction more, "I'll have pie when you get back," which was, Nora had understood, Hattie's version of, "I believe you. I'm here. Go do what needs doing." Douglas Pratt was at the front of the room, speaking to 2 other men whose names Nora didn't know, but whose posture communicated long acquaintance with Pratt's particular brand of community stewardship. He saw Silas come in. He saw Nora. His expression reorganized itself into something careful. The meeting was called to order by a man named Fletcher, who was apparently the kind of person communities appoint to chair difficult conversations because he had the ability to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things. It was not officially about Nora Bellamy. The agenda, Fletcher explained, was about community standards and the responsibilities of prominent landholders to uphold the social fabric of Ironwood Valley. But within the first 10 minutes, it had become unmistakably about Nora Bellamy, in the way of all such gatherings, through the careful use of phrases like "a woman of uncertain background," and questions about the appropriateness of the current arrangement at Mercer Ranch, and the importance of ensuring that the most visible households in the valley reflect well on all of us. Nora listened. She had made a decision, coming in. She was going to listen first. She was going to give the room its full shape before she decided what to do with it. She had learned this from 11 years of sickroom management. You don't act on the first symptom. You wait until you can see the whole picture. Pratt spoke for 7 minutes. "I was good at it," she admitted that. He had the particular skill of saying damaging things in the language of concern. He didn't attack Nora directly. He talked about the importance of appropriate arrangements and the value of understanding a person's full history and the difficulty of making sound judgments without complete information. He referenced, without naming, the letter from Edwin Pike. He referenced, without naming, the anonymous note. He managed to suggest, through implication alone, that Silas had acted hastily and that the community, as Silas's neighbors and friends, had a responsibility to raise the matter. He was very good at it. When he finished, the room murmured, not in agreement exactly, more in the uncertain way of a group that has been presented with something and is waiting to see what happens next. Silas stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. When Silas Mercer stood up in a room, the room changed its quality without being told to. He said, "I've listened to what Douglas has said and I want to address it plainly, because that's the only way I know how to address things." The room went quiet. Miss Bellamy came to Mercer Ranch 6 weeks ago. She came because I wrote and asked for someone capable of managing a large household, and she was, of her own choice, the most honest person who responded to that inquiry. She is the most competent person in that house, and I include myself in that. She has made that house function in ways it has not functioned in 12 years. She has done this without complaining, without overreaching, and without asking for anything except to be allowed to do her work. Pratt started to say something. Silas held up one hand briefly, and Pratt stopped. "The letter from Edwin Pike." Silas said the name without any particular inflection, but something in the room shifted at the directness of naming it. "Says things about Nora Bellamy's character that are not true. I know they're not true because I have spent 6 weeks watching her character in action, which is considerably more reliable evidence than the account of a man I have never met who has a personal interest in how that story gets told." A woman near the back said something quiet to the person next to her. Nora couldn't hear it. "I also want to say something about the note that was left under the kitchen door at Mercer Ranch." Silas's voice did not rise, but it acquired a particular quality. The quality of a man who is about to draw a line and intends it to be permanent. Whoever wrote that note wrote it at night, without signing their name, because they knew that what they were doing was not something a person could stand behind in daylight. If they are in this room, I want them to know that I know the kind of courage that took, and I want them to think about what that says about their own character relative to the woman they were trying to damage. The room was very still. "I am not asking this community for permission to make decisions about my own house," Silas said. "I don't require it, and I won't be seeking it. What I will say is this. Nora Bellamy is the kind of woman that this valley would benefit from having. And whatever some of you have decided to make of her past, I have decided to make of it exactly this: that a woman who has survived what she has survived and still manages to bring something real into a house that has been empty for a long time is not a woman anyone here should be talking about in the language that has been used tonight." He sat down. The silence lasted long enough to have a texture. Then, from near the back wall, Cal said, and he said it in the flat, unhurried way he said everything, as if it were self-evident, "I've been working Mercer Ranch for 9 years. The food alone is worth any argument about it." A surprise sound ran through the room. Not quite laughter, but the release of something. 2 or 3 people smiled. Pete, who Nora had not seen come in, was standing near the door with his hat in his hands and his ears red. Fletcher tried to reconvene the formal discussion, but the room had shifted. The particular gathered energy that had filled it when Nora arrived, that weighted attention, had broken into something different, something more ordinary. People began talking to each other in the normal way of people who have been through something and are now processing it. Douglas Pratt left without speaking to Silas. On the way home, in the wagon, Nora and Silas were quiet for a while. The stars were out. The cold had the specific dry quality it got in deep November, when Montana had fully committed to winter and wasn't reconsidering. "You didn't have to say all of that," Nora said. "I know. Some of those people had already made up their minds," he said. "The ones who hadn't are the ones that matter. And the ones who had—" He paused. "They'll come around or they won't. Either way, I said what was true." Nora looked at the road ahead. "You told them I was the most competent person in the house, including yourself." "That was possibly the most contentious thing I said," he agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Cal will never let you forget it." "Cal has been quietly enjoying this entire situation from the beginning," Silas said. "He thinks I've been running things adequately for 9 years, and you walked in and made him realize I'd been missing several obvious things." "He's not wrong," Nora said. Silas looked at her. She looked back. And then something happened that had not happened between them before. They both laughed, at the same moment, at the same thing, not the polite laughter of people trying to ease a situation, but the real kind, the kind that comes from having survived something together. It lasted only a few seconds, but it settled something. When they got back, Hattie had the pie ready, as promised, dried apple, with a lattice crust that was better than anything Nora had managed with pastry, which she freely admitted. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, and ate pie at 11 o'clock at night, and Hattie said, "Well?" And Silas told her what he'd said, and Hattie listened and at the end said, "Good," in a tone that closed the subject the way a door closes. 3 days after the community hall, Beatrice Mercer sent a letter. Nora had not known Silas had a sister until Hattie mentioned her in passing, about 3 weeks into Nora's time at the ranch. She'd said, "His sister Beatrice writes twice a year. She lives in Billings. She's formidable." The pause before formidable told Nora everything the word itself didn't. The letter, which arrived on a Saturday morning, was addressed to Silas and contained, according to his summary, at the supper table that evening, 3 things: a thorough accounting of everything Beatrice had heard about the current situation at Mercer Ranch, several pointed questions, and the information that she would be arriving in 2 weeks to assess matters in person. "Assess matters," Nora repeated. "Those were her words," Silas said. "How formidable," Nora said. "Is formidable?" Hattie answered before Silas could. "She ran the Mercer household from the age of 16 after their mother got sick," she said. "Then she married a Billings banker and ran his household and 2 charitable organizations simultaneously. She has opinions. They are well organized and clearly communicated, and she does not change them without considerable evidence." Nora absorbed this. "She's going to think I'm unsuitable." "She's going to think many things," Hattie said. "She'll say most of them." "She's also," Silas said, "the most fair person I know. Whatever she decides, she'll have reasons. Real ones." "That's not entirely comforting," Nora said. "No," he agreed, "but it's honest." The 2 weeks before Beatrice's arrival were not the uncomfortable waiting period Nora had braced for. Things had changed after the community hall, in small but real ways. The particular tension that had been building in Ironwood Valley, that sense of something pressing from outside the ranch fence, had not disappeared but had altered its quality. It was still there, but it was the pressure of something that has been named and addressed rather than something still building underground. The ranch hands ate longer at meals. Cal and Silas had a conversation at the supper table, an actual conversation, the kind that goes back and forth rather than just reporting, about whether the east fence needed a complete rebuild or targeted repair, and it ran long enough that Nora had time to wash the dishes and come back and refill both their cups. Pete had started asking her to teach him things, in the oblique way of young people who want to learn but find the directness of asking embarrassing. He'd show up in the kitchen at odd moments and say things like, "I was wondering how you know when bread's done without looking at it," and she'd tell him, and he'd stand there absorbing it with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely storing information. She found herself, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, not simply managing something, but living inside something. There was a difference. Managing was the state she'd been in for 11 years, a perpetual alert response to difficulty. This was different. This was waking up in a house that felt like it was organized around life rather than just survival. She was careful with it. She didn't let herself get used to it too quickly, because she'd learned that things you get used to too quickly are the things that hurt worst when they change. But she let herself have it a little. She let herself notice when Silas's step in the hall outside the kitchen in the evenings had become a sound she listened for. She let herself notice that she had started learning the small preferences of everyone in the house. Hattie took less salt than the rest. Cal preferred his coffee cooled slightly before drinking. Pete ate faster when he was troubled by something and slower when he wasn't. She let herself notice that she had opinions about the upper rooms that had been sealed off and cold, that she'd catch herself thinking, "That room gets the morning light, which is the right light for someone who rises early." She noticed all of this carefully and kept it to herself and went on working. Beatrice Mercer arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a hired coach that she'd arranged herself, sending no word ahead except the initial letter. She was 61 years old, silver-haired, erect as a flagpole, and she walked into the front hallway of Mercer Ranch with the particular gait of a woman who has never once in her adult life been unsure of whether she had the right to enter a room. She looked at Nora with a directness that Nora matched without looking away. "You're the Bellamy woman," Beatrice said. "I am," said Nora. "You look more capable than I expected from the descriptions." "What did the descriptions say?" "That you were plain and practical and possibly desperate." Beatrice said it without cruelty, as a simple report of received intelligence. "Two of three aren't insults." "I know which two you mean," Nora said. A pause. Beatrice's expression didn't change, but something in it calibrated slightly, the way a measuring instrument settles when it finds the level it was looking for. "Where's my brother?" Beatrice said. "South Field. I sent Pete to fetch him when I heard the coach." "And you answered the door yourself." "Hattie's doing the linens. I was nearest." Beatrice looked at her for another moment. Then she removed her coat and held it out to no one in particular and said, "I'd like tea, and I'd like to see the kitchen." The kitchen inspection was thorough. Beatrice opened things without asking, looked at the accounts that Nora kept on the side shelf, examined the dried stores, ran her finger along a high shelf near the back, and looked at what wasn't on it, which was dust. She asked questions that were practical and specific. The cost per head of the current feed arrangement, how Nora handled the menu rotation through deep winter, what she did about the flu problem on the right side of the stove. Nora answered everything directly and without embellishment. "You found the overcharge with the feed merchant," Beatrice said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen it in the accounts. 8 months of overcharging. Silas addressed it. "I would have caught it in 3 months." "You probably would have," Nora said. "You run better accounts than Hattie." Beatrice looked at her. "Hattie knows I run better accounts than she does. We have agreed not to discuss it." "I won't mention it," Nora said. Beatrice sat down at the kitchen table. She wrapped both hands around her teacup and looked at Nora across the table with the focused regard of someone who has assessed many things and has a reliable method. "Tell me about Kansas," she said. Nora told her. Not the version she'd assembled for difficult audiences, but the actual version. Her mother, the 11 years, the homestead, the $31, Edwin Pike, and the 9-day letter. The letter she'd written to Silas and why she'd written it the way she'd written it. She said it plainly, the same way she said everything, without asking for sympathy and without pretending the hard parts weren't hard. Beatrice listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, she was quiet for a moment, still holding her cup. "He chose your letter," Beatrice said. "He did. Because it didn't have any flowers in it." "I imagine so. He once told me," Beatrice said, "when he was about 23 and I was still trying to manage his social life as if it were a ledger I could balance, that the only thing he couldn't tolerate in a person was dishonesty that masqueraded as charm. I thought he was being unnecessarily difficult." She set down her cup. "He was not being unnecessarily difficult." Silas came in from the South Field 20 minutes later, cold and muddy, and stopped short when he saw his sister at the kitchen table with her hands around an empty teacup. Then he crossed the room and kissed her on the top of the head in the brief, practiced way of a person who has done this all his life. And she permitted it in the way of a woman who disapproves of displays of affection and accepts them from exactly one person. "You're early," he said. "I'm on time," she said. "You were expecting me to be late." She looked at him with the particular attention of an older sister who has been watching someone for decades. "You're different." "I'm muddy," he said. "Both things can be true," she said. "Sit down. You look like you've been out since before breakfast." He sat. Nora put coffee in front of him without being asked because it was 4:30 and he'd been in the South Field, and that was what was needed. He reached for it without looking up, and then paused, and looked at the cup, and then at Nora in the brief, slightly startled way he sometimes had, as if the fact of being taken care of still occasionally surprised him. Beatrice watched this exchange. She watched it with the expressionless attention of someone cataloging something. The supper that night was unlike any previous supper at Mercer Ranch, in that Beatrice Mercer at a table produced a specific social gravity. Everyone sat straighter, spoke more carefully, and ate with slightly better table manners than usual. Pete cut his biscuit with a knife rather than tearing it, which Nora noted with quiet appreciation on his behalf. Cal addressed Beatrice as ma'am, with the seriousness of someone who recognized a specific kind of authority when it sat across from him. Beatrice was not unkind at supper. She was direct and attentive, and asked questions that showed she had been listening carefully to everything that had been said to her that afternoon. She asked Cal about the East Fence situation, with enough technical knowledge that Cal revised his initial manner and started talking to her as if she might actually understand the answer, which she did. She asked Pete what he was working on learning, and Pete, who had not expected a direct question, said, "Miss Bellamy's teaching me about baking," and then looked as if he hadn't entirely planned to say that. Beatrice looked at Nora. "Is that so?" "He asked," Nora said. "He's good at it." Pete's ears went red. "Useful thing," Beatrice said, and turned back to her plate. After supper, while Nora was in the kitchen and Hattie was doing the final round of the upper rooms, Beatrice found Silas in his study. Nora could hear the low exchange of voices. Not the words, just the shape and the rhythm of it. A long conversation. The kind that moves through several different territories. She washed the dishes. She was drying the last of the cups when the study door opened and she heard Beatrice in the hallway saying, "I'm going to bed. I'm not 20 anymore, and that coach was 3 hours on a bad road." A pause. Then, She's the best thing that's happened to this house in 12 years. If you let this valley talk you out of what is obvious, I will consider it the most expensive mistake of your life, and I will mention it with some regularity." Silas said something too quiet to hear. Beatrice said, "Good. That's settled then." Her footsteps went up the stairs. Nora stood in the kitchen with a dry cup in her hands and the particular feeling of someone who has just heard something they weren't meant to hear and doesn't know exactly where to put it. She put the cup on the shelf. She was still standing there when Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. They looked at each other. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "I wasn't trying to," she said. "I know." He came into the kitchen. He didn't have his coffee cup this time. He stood in the middle of the kitchen with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at her with the expression she had never quite been able to read, the one that was present and direct and held something she hadn't yet been able to fully name. "She's right," he said. Nora waited. "She's also the most opinionated person I have ever known, and she's been telling me what to do since I was 8 years old, and she is occasionally wrong," he added. "Occasionally," Nora said. "Occasionally." He exhaled, looked at the floor for a moment, and then back at her. Nora. Just her name. She had heard him say her name before, at meals, in practical contexts, in the way you say someone's name when you need their attention. This was different. This was her name used as the full content of what he was saying, not the opening of something else. She waited. "I'm not good at saying things," he said. "You know that by now." "You're better than you think you are," she said. "Maybe." He was looking at her steadily. "I want to say this right, so I'm going to say it plainly, which is the only way I actually know how." She had stopped breathing in any way she could feel. "I don't want you here because this house needed a capable woman," he said. "I mean, it did, and you are. But that stopped being the whole truth sometime around the 4th week when I realized I was finding reasons to come to the kitchen at night that had nothing to do with coffee." He stopped, seemed to decide something. "I want you to stay. Not in the position you came here in. I want you to stay as mine, if that's something you're willing to consider." The kitchen was very quiet. "Silas," she said, "you don't have to answer tonight." "I know," she said, "but I'm going to anyway." She looked at him across the kitchen, across everything that had accumulated between them, the accounts, and the cold mornings, and the bandage on his hand, and 2 cups of coffee, and 1 community hall and a pie eaten at 11 o'clock, and a laugh shared in a wagon coming home in the dark. "Yes," she said, "that's something I'm willing to consider." He held still for a moment, then, "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes, Silas." Something moved through his face, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would have looked like anything from a distance. But she was close enough to see it, and what it was the specific easing of a man who has been braced for something difficult for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop. He crossed the kitchen. He took both her hands in his, careful, deliberate, the same hands that managed 8,000 acres and mended tack, and had once gone untreated because he didn't think his own injuries were worth the trouble, and he held them and looked at her. "I should have said it better," he said. "You said it true," she said. "That's better than better." They stood in the kitchen of a house that had been empty for 12 years, in the specific warmth of a room that smelled like dried apple pie and wood smoke and coffee. Outside, Montana winter pressed against every window. Inside, the table that had been built for a large family and had sat mostly empty stood in the next room, waiting. The question of what filled it was beginning, finally, to have an answer. Beatrice stayed 10 days. She had said 2 weeks in her letter, but she revised this on the third morning at breakfast, without preamble, in the way she did most things. "I'll stay 10 days, she said, pouring her own coffee because she had decided on day 2 that she preferred to pour her own coffee rather than wait for it. "I have what I need to know, and the rest is private." Nobody asked what she meant by "the rest is private." It was sufficiently clear. Those 10 days were, in their way, the strangest and most ordinary Nora had experienced since arriving in Montana. Strange because everything had shifted the night Silas had stood in the kitchen and said what he said, and she had said yes, and something between them had changed its shape permanently. Ordinary because the ranch did not stop for feelings. The stove still needed banking at night, the hands still needed feeding at 5:30, the accounts still needed doing, and a Montana December did not pause to acknowledge that 2 people had decided something in a kitchen. They didn't announce it. There was nothing to announce yet. He hadn't asked her formally, and she hadn't formally accepted, and both of them understood without discussing it that the next step required more than one evening in a kitchen. But things were different in the ways that are visible to people who pay attention, which meant that Hattie knew within approximately 6 hours, and Cal probably knew within 24, and Pete knew when he noticed that Silas had started coming to breakfast 5 minutes earlier than usual and spending that 5 minutes in the kitchen doorway talking to Nora about nothing in particular. Pete mentioned this to no one, which showed a maturity Nora hadn't expected from him and appreciated considerably. Beatrice, for her part, conducted herself with complete discretion on the subject, which Nora suspected was less about tact and more about the fact that she had said what she'd said in the hallway, heard Silas's response, and considered the matter organized. She redirected her considerable energy toward things she found genuinely interesting, which turned out to include the household accounts, the state of the upper rooms, and a long conversation with Hattie that lasted an entire afternoon, and from which both women emerged looking like they'd conducted a thorough audit of 14 years and found it satisfactory. On the 8th day, Beatrice came to find Nora in the kitchen after the hands had cleared out from supper. She sat down at the table and folded her hands and looked at Nora with the expression Nora had come to associate with her preparing to say something she had organized carefully. "I want to tell you something," Beatrice said, "about Silas." "All right," Nora said. "When Clara died, he shut down," Beatrice said. "Not the way people say someone shuts down when they mean the person is sad and quiet. I mean, he reorganized himself around the absence, took everything that had been personal and made it functional. The ranch ran beautifully. He never missed a thing that needed doing. He just—" She paused. "He stopped being anyone's. That's the only way I can say it. He was everyone's rancher and nobody's person." Nora listened. "I visited every year," Beatrice said, "for 12 years. I watched him manage this place with total competence and complete emotional efficiency, and I told myself, he's fine, he's surviving, that's enough. But it wasn't enough. It was just all there was." She looked at her folded hands. "What I saw when I walked into this house 3 days ago was my brother being someone's person again. That's—" Her voice shifted, very slightly, the way a voice shifts when someone is being honest about something they don't usually show. "That matters to me more than I have the language for," Nora said carefully. "He matters to me." "I know," Beatrice said. "That's apparent to everyone with eyes." She looked up. "I also want to say that what Douglas Pratt did, and what was done with that note, and what Edwin Pike wrote in that letter, none of that reflects on you. Those things reflect entirely on the people who did them. I want you to know that I see that clearly, even if parts of this valley have been slower about it." Nora thought about what to say and settled on something true. "Some of this valley has been exactly decent," she said. "Cal, Pete, Fletcher didn't have to let Silas speak as long as he did. 2 women at the general store who I didn't expect have been quietly kind." She paused. "People aren't all one thing, even the difficult ones." Beatrice looked at her for a moment. "That is a remarkably generous view for someone who's been through what you've been through in the last 2 months." "It's not generosity," Nora said. "It's just accurate. Generous would be pretending Pratt didn't mean what he meant." Beatrice's mouth did something that was almost a smile. "I like you," she said, in the tone of someone reporting a fact that has surprised them somewhat. I didn't expect to like you. I expected to respect you, possibly, if the accounts of your competence held up. The liking was additional. I like you too, Nora said. You're the most direct person I've met since I left Kansas. Silas says I'm exhausting. Silas finds honesty restful, Nora said. He's just not accustomed to it coming that fast. This time Beatrice actually smiled, briefly and fully, and Nora saw in it a flash of what Silas's face must have looked like 20 years ago, before it learned to be careful. Beatrice left on the 10th day as promised, kissed Silas on the top of the head again, told Hattie to write more often, and looked at Nora in the front hallway with a directness that had become, in 10 days, familiar and almost comfortable. Write to me, Beatrice said. Not about the ranch, about things. I will, Nora said. The hired coach took her back toward Billings, and the ranch settled back into its own shape, and December deepened around them. Silas asked her to marry him on a Thursday. Not because Thursday was significant in any way, but because Thursday was when it happened, and it happened the way most real things between them happened, without ceremony, in the kitchen, in the ordinary context of a day that hadn't been arranged to be special. He came in from the evening round with frost in his beard and sat at the table, and she put coffee in front of him, and he wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her and said, I want to do this properly. She sat down across from him. All right. I should have a ring, he said. I know that. I don't have one yet. That's a failure of planning on my part. Silas, I want to be honest about the ring situation before I continue. Silas. What? Ask me, she said. He looked at her. The frost was still in his beard. There was a small cut on his jaw from the cold wind, the kind that comes in deep December, when the air itself becomes something that damages on contact. He was not a polished man, and he was not making a polished proposal. He was sitting in a kitchen in his work clothes at the end of a long day with cold hands and a coffee cup and the full, unvarnished truth of who he was, which was who Nora had come to know and come to love, without planning to and without apology. Will you marry me? He said. Not because the house needs you, though it does. Not because I need someone practical, though I do. Because I want to go on having you across the table from me for the rest of however long I've got, and I want that to be a thing that's real and settled and not a question anymore. Nora looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. I already told you yes. That was a preliminary yes, he said. This is the official question. Then yes, she said. Official, settled, not a question anymore. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his, and they sat like that in the kitchen for a minute without saying anything else. Because everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that hadn't been said was held between them in the particular silence that had been building since the night she'd stepped off a train and he'd carried her suitcase and told her she must be tired. She brought him a ring the following week. Not the other way around, which was not how it was usually done. But Nora had never been particularly interested in how things were usually done. She'd had a small ring of her mother's, a plain band with a single chip of garnet that wasn't valuable by any measure except the one that mattered. She gave it to him and said, This is what I have. If you want to replace it, that's fine. But I wanted you to have something from me, not just the other way around. He held the ring for a moment, turning it in his fingers. Then he said, I'll put it on a chain and keep it, which she hadn't expected at all, and which was one of those moments she filed away carefully, without comment, because it was private and real and did not need any decoration. He gave her a ring he'd had made in ironwood, plain gold, wide enough to sit solidly on a working hand. No stones, no flourish. It fit. They were married in February, on a day when the snow was deep and the sky was the particular clear blue that Montana produced in winter, as if to compensate for everything else winter cost. The ceremony was at the ranch because neither of them had any interest in a church, and because the house was large enough and had been returned, room by room, over the past 3 months, to something approaching the life it had been built for. Hattie made the cake. Beatrice came from Billings and spent the ceremony standing with the particular erect posture of someone who is moved but is not going to show it to anyone watching. Cal stood with his hat in his hands and his chin slightly raised. Pete had borrowed a jacket from somewhere that didn't quite fit his shoulders and wore it with complete seriousness. 4 of the hands who had been at Mercer Ranch longest attended. Two of the Ironwood women who had been quietly kind came, and one of them brought her husband, who shook Silas's hand and looked at Nora with the frank reassessment of a man who has decided he got something wrong and is willing to admit it. Douglas Pratt was not there. Nobody mentioned this. There was no need to. The ceremony itself was brief, said by the county magistrate, who had ridden out in the cold with the philosophical acceptance of a man who had learned that Montana required philosophical acceptance of many things. Silas and Nora stood facing each other in the front room that had once held furniture that nobody used, which Nora had, over the past month, quietly returned to its purpose. Fire going, curtains opened, the table set. When the magistrate asked Silas whether he took this woman, Silas said, "I do," in the same plain voice he used to say everything true, and looked at Nora the whole time, and it was enough. When the magistrate asked Nora, she said, "I do," and meant all of it, and did not look away. The ring was already on her hand. They ate Hattie's cake, and Beatrice talked to Cal about irrigation with a focus that suggested she was genuinely interested, and Pete ate 3 pieces of cake before anyone could stop him, and someone brought out a fiddle, and someone else produced a harmonica from somewhere, and there was, for the first time in that house, and longer than anyone could say with certainty, music. Nora stood near the kitchen doorway at one point in the middle of the evening and looked at the room, at the people in it, at the lit windows, at Silas across the space listening to something Cal was telling him with his arms folded, and the specific quality of attention that meant he was genuinely interested and not just being polite, and she thought about a Kansas kitchen in winter. She thought about $31 and a battered suitcase and a letter she'd written with shaking hands because she had nothing to lose except her dignity, and even that she'd decided to risk. She thought, I didn't come here for this. I came here because there was nowhere else to go. And then, more quietly, more honestly, but I stayed for this. Every morning at 4:45, every bowl of stew, every cup of tea with Hattie, every night lying awake listening to the wind, I stayed for this. I chose it every day before I knew what it was going to be. That felt important. Not the outcome, the choosing. The daily, imperfect, frightened, stubborn choosing to still be here on Saturday. Silas found her in the doorway and stood next to her and looked at the room. Good party, he said. Hattie's cake, she said. I had nothing to do with the cake. The pie you made last week was better. Don't tell Hattie that. I have more sense than that. He was quiet for a moment. Then, are you happy? She looked at him. Right now? Right now, tonight. Are you? She thought about it the way she thought about things she wanted to answer honestly, with a moment's actual consideration, without the instinct to reassure. Yes, she said. Not perfectly. Not without anything I'm still figuring out, but yes. Actually, yes. Good, he said, and took her hand, which was still new enough between them that she felt it the way you feel new things, with the full surface of your attention. That's what I needed to know. Marriage turned out to be, as Nora had privately expected, considerably more complicated than the evening in the kitchen where it had been decided. Not difficult in the ways that break things, difficult in the ways that build them. The slow accumulation of learning another person from the inside of shared days, which is entirely different from learning them from the outside of admiration. She learned that Silas was not a simple man underneath the simplicity he projected. He was direct, yes, and honest, and steadier than most people she'd known. But he was also stubborn in specific and unpredictable ways, and he had a capacity for silence that occasionally crossed the line from peaceful to withholding. And he had not, in 12 years of living alone, developed any particular skill at saying when something was bothering him before it had been bothering him for several days. She told him this, on a March evening when they'd had their first real argument, about something practical, the way first arguments in marriages usually are, the money for the upper room repairs, and whether it was the right season to start them. And the argument had wound down, and they were sitting on opposite ends of the kitchen table, not quite looking at each other. You go quiet when something's wrong, she said, and by the time you say anything, it's been wrong for 3 days, and you're twice as fixed about it as you would have been on day 1. He considered this. That's accurate, he said. It makes things harder than they need to be. I know. A pause. I'm working on it. I know you are, she said. I'm just telling you I noticed it, so you know you can say it sooner. Another pause. You do something too, he said. She looked at him. When you think something isn't your place to address, you don't address it, even when it clearly is your place. You still ask permission you don't need. She thought about this. The upper rooms, she said. The upper rooms, and other things. You live here, Nora. You're not a guest who's been extended a courtesy. You don't need to look at me before you decide what happens in your own house. She sat with that for a moment. It was true. She still caught herself checking. Not with him explicitly, but internally. The old habit of a woman who'd spent most of her adult life in a space that belonged technically to someone else, and knew, at some deep-learned level, that her presence was conditional. That's going to take longer to fix than your silences, she said. Probably, he agreed. So we'll just both work on it. They sat quietly for a while. Outside, March was doing what Montana March did, which was to pretend winter was over and then deliver a sharp reminder that it wasn't. I don't regret it, she said. In case you were wondering. I wasn't, he said, but I'm glad you said it. Are you? No, he said before she finished. I am not. In case you were wondering. She almost smiled. I wasn't. But you're glad I said it. Yes, she said. I am. It was spring when two things happened that Nora hadn't planned for, arriving close enough together that she would always think of them as related, which they were not, except in the way that everything that happens in a life becomes related in retrospect. The first was the market. Hattie had been bringing baked goods to the Ironwood Valley market for years. Practical things, well-made, nothing fancy. That spring, Nora began bringing things too, which she hadn't planned as a business venture, but simply as a use of what she made in excess of what the house needed. The first week she brought 24 rolls and a pair of dried apple pies. They sold in 40 minutes. The woman who ran the market stall next door, a taciturn person named Greer, who sold root vegetables and seemed to consider conversation an unnecessary expense, told Nora flatly, 3 weeks into the arrangement, that people were coming to the market specifically to get to the Mercer Ranch table before it sold out. You should bring more, Greer said. I don't have time to make more, Nora said. Then charge more, Greer said, and turned back to her root vegetables. Nora thought about this for several days and then told Silas, not asking permission but telling him, which was the distinction they were working on. He listened and then said, "What do you need?" Which was, she was learning, his version of yes. She made an arrangement with Pete, who had continued developing his baking skills with the quiet persistence of a young person who has found something he's good at and isn't going to announce it loudly, but isn't going to stop either. He came in 2 mornings a week before his regular work and helped with the market batches, and she paid him out of the proceeds, which he accepted with a seriousness that told her he'd been thinking about the money before she offered it. By summer, the Mercer Ranch table at the Ironwood Market had become a specific destination. Women who had whispered about Nora in the general store 6 months earlier now told each other which days she brought the cinnamon bread. The woman from the dry goods counter stopped Nora one Thursday and said, with the awkward directness of someone making a partial amend, "My daughter loves your rolls. She asks for them every week." She did not say, "I'm sorry I was part of the talk," but she said the thing she could say, and Nora took it. She didn't need the apology to be explicit. Explicit apologies were for people who needed the ceremony of being forgiven. What Nora needed was just to be seen correctly, and being seen correctly didn't require a speech. It could happen over a market table on a Thursday morning in May. The second thing that happened in spring was the letter from Lydia Crane. It came through a chain of forwarding addresses that took 3 weeks to reach Mercer Ranch, passed along by a woman in Kansas who had known Nora's mother and had somehow gotten word of what Nora had done, the letter to Silas, the move, the marriage, and had passed this information to a young woman who had been asking around desperately about mail-order arrangements with Western ranchers. The letter was from Lydia Crane, 24 years old, who was preparing to travel west to meet a man she'd been corresponding with for 4 months, and who was, as the letter said with the particular mixture of bravery and terror that Nora recognized immediately, not at all sure she was making the right decision or that she was enough for the life she was stepping into. She had heard about Nora from the Kansas woman. She had heard that Nora was plain and practical and had survived being turned away once and had gone west anyway and had found something real. She wanted to know. The letter said this directly, with a candor that Nora found immediately likable. She wanted to know how. How had Nora walked off a train in a strange place and not run when it was hard? How had she stayed? Nora sat with the letter for a full day before she answered it. She sat with it because she wanted to answer it honestly, which required being honest with herself first about what had actually happened, rather than the tidied version that was already forming in her memory. The version where she'd been braver and more certain than she actually was. She thought about the morning she'd written to Silas, the actual morning, the way her hands had been unsteady on the pen. She thought about the train journey and the 3 weeks of preparing herself for his disappointment. She thought about the cold kitchen in the back of the ranch house and the first note under the door and the gathering in the community hall and the night on the porch with Vivian Calder. She thought about all the mornings she had gotten up at 4:45, not because she was brave, but because the alternative, not getting up, not starting the stove, not making the biscuits, was a choice she was not willing to make, and that distinction mattered. She had not been fearless. She had been afraid, and she had done it anyway, which was entirely different and much more useful as information. She wrote back to Lydia Crane on the second day, in the evening, at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd done the accounts, and bandaged Silas's hand and said yes twice and had her first real argument and made 10,000 small decisions that had accumulated, without her fully noticing, into a life. She wrote, "I wanted to be honest with you because the honest version is more useful than the encouraging one. I was frightened the entire time. I was frightened on the train and frightened when I stepped onto the platform and frightened every day for the first month when it could have gone wrong in a dozen ways. I did not handle any of it with particular grace. I dropped things and said the wrong thing at the wrong moment and misjudged people I should have read more carefully, and there were nights I lay awake wondering if I had made an enormous mistake. What I can tell you is this. The fear didn't go away, but it stopped being the thing that decided my actions. That's the only shift that matters. You don't need to stop being afraid. You need to keep moving anyway, and you need to know that your worth is not determined by whether someone in a new place decides to see it immediately. Some people will. Some won't. That's true everywhere, not just out west. I came here not knowing if I was enough. I found out that I had been carrying what was needed all along and simply hadn't been in the right place to use it. I cannot promise you that will be your story too, but I can promise that you will not find out what your story is by staying where you are. Get on the train, hold your head up when you step off it, see what's true before you decide what to fear." She sealed the letter, addressed it, set it on the side of the table where outgoing mail waited. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table in the quiet of the evening. Silas came in from the study. He'd been working on accounts, the bigger ranch accounts that were his domain, the ones that dealt in cattle numbers rather than household flour. And he saw her at the table and sat down across from her the way he always did, now, easily, without needing a reason. "Letter?" he said. "From a young woman in Kansas," Nora said. "About to make a difficult journey. She was asking for, I don't know exactly. Not advice. Permission, maybe. Or just to know that someone else had done it." Silas looked at the letter on the edge of the table. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," Nora said. "That it's frightening and imperfect and worth it." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what it was?" "Yes," she said. "Not in that order. Imperfect first, frightening the whole way through, worth it. I'm still finding out how much. But yes." He looked at her with the expression she had finally, after months, learned to read completely. It was the expression of a man who has spent 12 years not being sure what he was coming home to and has now been coming home to the same woman for months, and finds that this has rearranged something fundamental in how he understands his own life. "Worth it," he said quietly, not as a question. "Worth it," she said, firmly, without qualification. He reached across the table, touched the back of her hand briefly, the way he did when he meant something he didn't always have the words for. She turned her hand and held his. The summer and then the fall rearranged themselves around the life Mercer Ranch had become. Hattie's baking sold well alongside Nora's at the market, and Hattie, who had maintained for decades a professional distance from pride in her own work, began checking the empty trays at the end of market day with a look on her face that was indistinguishable from satisfaction. The upper rooms were opened, one by one, as Nora had planned in her head back in the winter when she'd been still a guest and hadn't said anything. The room with the morning light was given to Pete, who had by autumn become something neither of them had quite named. Not hired hand only, not family in any formal sense, but a young person who had attached himself to the warmth of this particular house with the specific tenacity of someone who hasn't had enough of it and recognizes it for what it is when he finds it. He moved his things up from the bunkhouse one afternoon without making a production of it. He put his extra shirt in the wardrobe and set his boots by the door and came down to supper and ate without saying anything about it. Silas didn't say anything either. Neither did Nora. Hattie moved the position of his cup at the kitchen table from the bunkhouse side of things to the house side of things, and that was that. October brought a letter from Lydia Crane. She had gotten on the train. She had arrived. The man she'd gone to meet was kind, and the land was beautiful, and she was frightened still, but a different kind of frightened. The kind that comes from being somewhere real rather than somewhere safe. She wrote, "I stepped off the train with my head up like you said. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I did it. Thank you for giving me permission to find out what I was." Nora read the letter twice and then folded it and kept it. She showed it to Silas that evening, and he read it and handed it back and said, "You gave her more than permission." "What did I give her?" "Evidence," he said, "that it was possible. That's different." She thought about that for a long time. The autumn wedding anniversary. They had been married 8 months, which was not long by any count, but felt substantial in the way that some things accumulate meaning faster than time, passed quietly. Silas gave her nothing except a letter, handwritten, which was not something she had expected from him, and which he delivered to the kitchen table in the morning without ceremony, the envelope slightly crooked where he'd sealed it. She opened it after he left for the morning work. He was not, as he'd said, good at saying things with words. The letter proved this and disproved it simultaneously. It was not eloquent. It did not have the shaped language of someone who had practiced putting feelings into sentences. But it was entirely true, every word of it, in the way that the first letter he'd sent her in Kansas had been true. And she understood now that this was his particular kind of eloquence, the unwavering accuracy of a person who refuses to say anything they don't mean. He wrote, "I was a man keeping a house running before you came. You made it a home. I did not know the difference until I had both to compare. I am better at this, at all of this, than I was before. And the credit belongs to you, though I know you will redirect it. Don't. I am giving it to you directly. You brought this. I am glad every day that you wrote that letter and got on the train and stayed." She sat at the kitchen table for a while after reading it. The house was quiet around her. The specific inhabited quiet of a place where people are present even when they're not in the room, where the sounds of life are temporary absence rather than permanent emptiness. She thought about the Kansas kitchen again, the last time. The bare shelves and the $31 and the letter she'd written with shaking hands. She thought about what she'd believed she was offering. A list of practical capabilities, nothing more. The inventory of a woman who had given up expecting to be wanted for anything beyond usefulness. She had been wrong about what she was offering, not wrong about the list, the cooking, the accounts, the steadiness in hard seasons. All of that was real and had mattered. But the list wasn't what had built this. What had built this was something she hadn't included in the letter because she hadn't known she had it to offer. The willingness to be honest when honesty was frightening. The refusal to pretend to be less difficult or more convenient than she was. The daily decision to stay and to mean it, not because she was fearless, but because she had decided, somewhere in the cold kitchen of her old life, that she was allowed to take up space in the world without apologizing for the shape of it. That was what Lydia Crane had needed to see in her. Not the successful outcome, the willingness. And that was what Silas had seen in the letter. Not a list of skills. A person who had decided to be real and sent it through the mail and waited to see what happened. She put the letter in the tin box she kept in her room with her mother's few letters and the note she'd received from Beatrice and the letter from Lydia. Evidence. Not of what she'd achieved, but of what had been possible when she'd stopped protecting herself from her own life. Hattie knocked on the kitchen door frame at 9 because Nora was still sitting at the table with her coffee, and Hattie, unlike Pete, did not pretend not to notice things. "You all right?" Hattie asked. "Yes," Nora said. Hattie came in and poured herself coffee and sat across from her, in the same chair Silas used. She looked at Nora with the particular perception of a woman who has watched people carefully for 60 years and doesn't miss much. "You're thinking about something," Hattie said. "I'm thinking about what it cost to get here," Nora said. "Not the money, the other cost." And I think it was the right price," Nora said, "for what I got." Hattie was quiet for a moment, holding her cup. Then, "My daughter's name is Frances," she said. "She's 31. She lives in Helena." Nora looked at her. They had not talked about Frances directly. She knew the outline. Hattie had mentioned once, briefly, that she had a daughter she hadn't seen in 11 years, and Nora had not pressed because Hattie did not welcome pressing, and the outline was all that had been offered. "She and I had an argument," Hattie said, in the tone of someone reporting a known fact. "A long time ago. About choices she was making that I thought were wrong. I said things." She stopped. "I said things I cannot unsay. She left, and I told myself she would come around, and then I told myself it was better this way, and then I told myself I didn't miss her, and by the time I stopped telling myself stories about it, 11 years had gone by." Nora said nothing. She understood that Hattie was not asking for a response. She was saying something she'd been carrying, and she'd chosen this morning to put it down, and the right thing was to let her put it down without rushing to pick it up. "I've been watching you," Hattie said. "Since you came, the way you just go toward things that are difficult instead of waiting for them to become impossible. I've been thinking—" She stopped. "I've been thinking about Frances." Nora waited. "I'm going to write to her," Hattie said. "I don't know what she'll say. She might not answer. She might answer in a way that is worse than not answering." She set down her cup. "But I'm going to write." Nora thought about Lydia Crane's letter. "I stepped off the train with my head up." "You should," Nora said. "I might need—" Hattie stopped. The word she didn't say was help. "Tell me what you want to say," Nora said. "I'll help you find the words." They sat together that morning, Hattie and Nora, at the kitchen table where so many things had been decided and decided again, and Hattie talked about Frances and what had happened and what she wished she'd said instead of what she'd said. And Nora listened and occasionally asked a question, and by the time Pete came in from the morning work stamping cold off his boots, there was a letter on the edge of the table waiting to be addressed to Helena. The response from Frances Crowell arrived 6 weeks later, on a gray November morning. Hattie read it alone, in her room, and came down to supper with her eyes slightly red in a way that she did not acknowledge and nobody mentioned. At the end of the meal, she said, "Frances is coming for Christmas," in the same tone she used to say that flour costs had increased, and then she picked up her plate and took it to the kitchen. Pete looked at Nora. Nora shook her head slightly. "Leave it." He did. That evening, later, when Silas was in the study and Pete had gone up to his room and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Hattie came to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of tea. She set one in front of Nora without asking. She sat down. They drank their tea. It was what they did when things were large. They didn't require it to be smaller. They just sat with it and let it be what it was. December came, and Frances came with it. A tall, composed woman with Hattie's eyes and her own particular careful bearing, who walked into Mercer Ranch and looked around her with the specific attention of someone trying to understand a place that had shaped the person she was trying to reconnect with. She and Hattie were formal with each other for the first day, then careful, then gradually something older and less careful began to surface, the way things do when people who love each other get through the first layer of the damage between them. On the second evening, Frances sat in the kitchen while Nora cooked, and she talked, not about the estrangement, but about Helena and her work there and a garden she'd planted that had done better than expected. Small things. The kind of things you tell people when you're finding out whether you can talk to them again. Nora listened and answered and gave her space and did not make it into anything it didn't need to be. After Frances went up to bed, Hattie appeared in the kitchen doorway and stood for a moment without saying anything. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what specifically?" Nora said. "For being the kind of person it was possible to watch," Hattie said, "so that I knew what it looked like." Nora didn't say anything. Hattie went to her room. Christmas at Mercer Ranch that year was not the event of anyone's particular planning. It became what it became because of the people who were there, Silas and Nora and Hattie and Frances and Pete, and 2 of the hands who had nowhere better to be, and Beatrice, who had made the trip from Billings because she had decided, with characteristic firmness, that she was going to and had seen no compelling argument against it. The table that had been built for a large family and had sat half empty for 12 years was full. Not because anyone had arranged it to be, not because someone had stood in the middle of an empty house and decided things were going to be different now, but because a woman had told the truth in a letter 6 months earlier and stayed when staying was difficult, and brought something into a house that had needed it without knowing it needed it, and the warmth had spread, the way warmth does when it's real, outward from the source, until it reached the edges of the room, and the room could hold it. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway at one point during the evening, the same doorway she'd stood in on her wedding night looking out at the room, and she looked at it again, at Frances helping Hattie with something at the sideboard, at Pete eating with the relaxed attention of a young person who feels safe, at Beatrice making a point to Cal that Cal was listening to with more respect than he gave most people, at Silas across the room who found her eyes at the same moment she found his. He raised his cup slightly. She raised hers. The simplest possible exchange, the full weight of everything between them carried in it. She thought, I am not the woman I was in that Kansas kitchen, not because I became something better or more impressive, but because I stopped being at war with what I was. She thought, that turned out to be enough, more than enough. The ranch had changed. The valley had changed in the particular slow way of places that can't entirely change but can shift, degree by degree, towards something more honest. Some people who had been unkind had moved towards something like decency, not all at once and not without cost, but moved. The ones who hadn't, Pratt, the anonymous note writer, Edwin Pike in his distant Kansas life, had receded to the edges where they belonged, neither forgiven wholesale nor held on to, simply made smaller than they'd once seemed. Nora Bellamy, who was now Nora Mercer, who had arrived in Montana with $31 and a battered suitcase, and the terrifying honesty of a woman with nothing to lose, stood in her own kitchen doorway in December with her cup of tea and looked at the table full of people and thought about Lydia Crane, wherever she was, finding out what her story was. She thought, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is what you do on the fourth week, when the newness has worn off and the difficulty has settled in and you cannot yet see the outcome. Courage is not the moment you step off the train. Courage is the next morning, and the morning after that, and every ordinary Tuesday when nothing is certain and you get up anyway and start the stove. She had built this on ordinary Tuesdays. One biscuit, one account column, one cup of tea, one true thing said plainly across a kitchen table, accumulated into this. Into a house that smelled like bread and wood smoke and the particular layered smell of a place where multiple lives were being lived at once. Into a table full of people. Into a man across the room who had looked at her letter when he could have looked at 47 others and had chosen the one that told the truth. Into herself, finally. Not the woman she'd been told she was, not the woman Edwin Pike had looked through without stopping, not the plain, forgettable woman from a struggling Kansas homestead who had spent 11 years being useful and expecting nothing. Herself. The full version. The one who had always been there, carrying what was needed, waiting for somewhere that could finally hold it. She was done waiting. She was here. She walked back